Rough Tiger production.
And you, and you, and you, and you were there. Some of it wasn't very nice, but most of it was beautiful. Hello, everybody. Hello, Bryan. What are you laughing about?
You just prior to us recording, doing your best, Sean Connery.
Yes. Welcome to welcome to Dream Idiots, episode 57, where each week my co-host Bryan and I trade stories, quizzes, all kinds of ridiculous stuff. If you were around for last week, unbelievably offensive curse words of the week.
Yes, last week I think I broke Morris.
So, Bryan, where can these fine folks who put up with way too much stuff from us find us?
Well, we're pretty much on every single podcast platform there is at this point. And if you're listening to us, if you can go on there and shoot us 5 stars, that'd be a huge help. Shoot us a review too, that'd be good. You can find us at dreamidiots.com. You can look at some merchandise we have on there. Our Instagram is Dream Idiots, Facebook is Dream Idiots, and you can even email us at dreamidiotspodcast@gmail.com. If you listened to last week, we sent out the little challenge. Come up with a good definition for our curse word was DeSantis. DeSantis needs a new meaning. We need to propagate a new meaning for that word. I'm not quite sure what that should be yet, but to suffer a desantisification, or I don't know, something nasty and cruel.
Yes, it should reflect. This should be an example of art reflecting life, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, we like to have more fun here than shooting at a weather balloon, and we take turns going first every week. And Bryan, it's old number 57 this week, so you get to go first this week on Dream Idiots.
All righty. So this week I'm diving back into let's just say call it a personal story. Instead of doing a profile or something historical, this is just something from a short story from my life that I found amusing that hopefully you will like as well. Story called Driving the Blind Crazy. When I'm not writing or podcasting, I engage in a strange professional activity. I drive around and show homes to complete strangers. For a number of years, I made things even odder. I would get in my car and pretend I was a taxi. For purposes of this story, we'll call it a service on your phone called Miffed. One Sunday morning, Mother's Day morning, in fact, I had been off showing pretty houses to ugly people, or perhaps it was the other way around, and decided to pick up a passenger or two. Happily, in the gig economy, you have complete control of your time. So I fired up the app and almost instantly was assigned a passenger. Eric had short brown hair and for some reason was wearing sunglasses in the postage stamp sized image on his profile. He was close by, apparently at a florist. Perhaps 3 minutes later, I was pulling up. I spied a man standing outside, almost at attention, brown hairs, dark glasses. There was a large bouquet in one hand and a long walking stick in the other. Eric was blind. I should say at this point that I don't like the blind. They make me feel weak or somehow less able-bodied than I actually am. They're able to move about in their world quite well, click-clacking down the street, either in complete blackness, I assume, or perhaps in a world that resembles a Van Gogh painting. Further, whenever I see a blind person, I feel instantly responsible for them. Please don't walk into that plate glass window. Please don't bang your head or trip on those stairs. Even if they are within sight of dozens of other strangers, I'd somehow be to blame. Or at least I would blame myself. So weirdly, it's always a small comfort when they turn the corner, leave the store, or board the bus. Whew, I came through again for those 20 seconds, and now they're in someone else's care. I pulled up right next to Eric and was able to roll down the passenger window and call his name. He expertly found the handle and irritatingly climbed into the front seat. I held his flowers for a moment, while he collapsed his cane and stowed it beneath his feet, then handed them back. I could see we were going some distance, probably 20 miles. We pulled away. So, off to see Mom? I offered idly. Well, no, he said, I'm not off to see anyone. Oh my God. I replied, that's just the expression. I didn't mean to. I'm just messing with you. He interrupted. I laughed at myself. I like this guy, I thought. Self-deprecating, good sense of humor, and a spirit of play. This ride might be fun. This might seem like an odd question, he said, but are these flowers okay? The guy that helped me had them ready in almost an instant, and I'm worried that I just paid top dollar for a dozen dead carnations. I was able to see a sticker reading Mother's Day arrangement, $24.95. It's actually perfect, I assured him. It's a couple carnations, one pink rose, baby's breath, and some greenery. Your mom will love it. Oh, good. He was visibly relieved. People don't really take advantage of your blindness, do they? I asked. No, most people are really nice, he said, but occasionally he trailed off. I sensed he had stories he didn't want to share, stories of perhaps spoiled food or being shortchanged, but I chose not to pry. Another odd question for you, he said. What's the color of my shirt? Red, I replied. Red? God damn it. I thought it was gray, he yelled. I said nothing, but I was thinking, what difference does it make? You're blind. Eric was now irritated, and I wasn't at all sure why. He leaned his seat back slightly, set the flowers on the floor, and pulled out an iPhone. And I quickly learned, perhaps obviously, that every app you and I use has also been adapted for the blind, all via verbal commands. I listened and was amused a bit at his anger. There is nothing funnier than sweet, kind, or loving messages delivered with a fuck you tone of voice. New message to Mary Lou, he growled. Great spending time with you and Steven, period. Have a fabulous Mother's Day, period. Hope we can do it again soon, period. Send message. Message sent. God damn it. New message to Kate, he muttered. Got your message, period. I appreciate your kindness more than I can say, period. Let's talk again soon, period. Send message, period. Message sent. God damn it. He had calmed down, maybe slightly, and asked, when you said it was red, did you mean like burgundy? He sounded hopeful. I'm afraid not, I said. That's red. Cherry red. Tomato red. Cardinal red. You're wearing a red turtleneck. Yeah, I'm clear that it's a turtleneck, he replied. Right. Of course you are. Now, curiosity was kicking in. I simply couldn't help myself. I had to know why it mattered. So you're upset that you're in red, I asked. I don't get why it matters. You're blind. So as long as you're not naked when I pull up or when you arrive at your job or anywhere else, surely you're good. No, you're literally the last person on the planet whose wardrobe is going to be judged. He sighed heavily and then tried to explain. I'm blind, right? I get all the attention I need. People are always watching me, watching out for me, and it just seems like there are always eyeballs on me. I'm banging into chairs, kicking doors, and tripping on things. My mom orders clothes for me, and she knows the rules. No buttons, no snaps, and no ties. Everything is a pull-on or a pull-over. No bright colors. I haven't always been blind. I know what red looks like, and I don't want it. Give me black, give me gray, give me brown or navy, and that's it. It has to be simple because this is hard enough. I had to admit that it made perfect sense. He continued, but my mother likes having people look out for me, and she wants me to be as obvious as possible. So she will tell me, okay, Eric, here's your new black sweater. And then I find out later it's actually orange. I keep trying to blend in, and she's endlessly dressing me like a fucking safety cone without my knowledge. My sister does it too. At this point, I had to laugh. I'm sorry, I said, but that's really funny and kind of cute at the same time. And I'm betting you've thrown away a lot of brightly colored clothes. Oh no, are you kidding? He said, that would be wasteful, according to Mom. So it's all in my closet, carefully sorted, so it's never actually worn. He had calmed down and certainly saw the humor in it, but he had a legitimate gripe. His life was hard enough as it was. I told him briefly about how I do the exact thing he hates, namely watch over blind people when I see them, and I have a mild anxiety attack every time a threat or an obstacle appears. So what do I do, if anything, I asked him. His reply was perfect in its simplicity. Treat me and all blind people like you'd treat anyone else. I'm happy to have a door open for me, but only do it if you would do it for anyone else that came along. Blind people are in control of their lives. I've been using this cane for 15 years. It's not perfect, but I get along just fine. That said, please don't let me step directly in front of a speeding bus. I laughed again and said, I'll remember that. Oh, and always remember that blindness only affects the eyes, he continued. My ears are just fine. Every Monday, my boss yells, Hi, Eric, how was your weekend? We turned off the highway and we were shortly pulling into the driveway of a retirement home, his mother's home. We pulled into this circular driveway in front under a portico. It had started to rain. The front doors are green, apparently, Eric said. I need to go in there. We just pulled into that drive. Those doors are 30 feet away, perpendicular from the car, and we're undercover so you won't get wet, I said. Now that I know that I'm in red, can you at least tell me if this shirt looks clean? I spill coffee and I get crumbs on things, and then I have no idea, he said, as he was climbing out of the car. He shook out his cane. I handed him the flowers. You look great, I said. No crumbs, no stains, hair looks good, and you're ready to go. And your shirt matches your shoes perfectly. There was a pause. My shoes are red too, he asked. I'm afraid so, Eric, I said. God damn it. He turned away, closing the door as he went. Tap, tap, tap over to the double doors to reception. I tooted my horn and yelled, Don't ruin her Mother's Day. He turned briefly, gave me a thumbs up, smiled, and was gone. Driving the blind crazy. Just a funny story.
It's nice to hear that story in a finished form. I remember you telling me that when it first happened, and that is great. That brings to mind the film that played endlessly on HBO. If You Could See What I Hear.
Oh,
Mark
I forgot
Singer
about that. Yeah.
Tom Sullivan. Yeah, it's got this great bit where his college roommate walks into his dorm room and says, Sullivan, you pervert, it's pitch black in here. And he flips on the lights and Sullivan says, I've got news for you. Still pitch black in here.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that you must have a litany of stories about folks, but this one really stood out to you in your days of chauffeuring.
Doing that hideous job. Yeah, I mean there weren't that many. I mean, folks were overwhelmingly nice. I don't have any horror stories, but there were in both of the jobs, working in real estate and then driving people around. You meet lots of strangers who people are certainly interesting. There was I don't know, very, very funny and sort of poignant that this guy is a seemingly happy guy, but his mother and his sister are torturing him in this way and playing these games with him, which I sort of love. Yeah, here is your new gray turtleneck.
So were his shoes really red, or were you just messing?
No, he had red slip-on sneakers of some sort. Yeah, and they were really red. And I was like, you know what? I'm sure he has no idea. I should probably tell him. So he probably took him off and threw him at his mother when he walked in there. But really, red shoes, Mom? Really?
Well, thank you, Bryan. That was awesome, and a nice little bit of humanity.
Nice bit of levity
in the midst of some of our awfulness that we try to get away with here.
Right. There you go. Idiots. And I'll actually this is actually written up, so I'll actually post this on Medium too. If anyone wants to see this story in written form, it'll be available in written form too. So there you have it. So shall we crawl back down amongst the filth? Do we have a curse word of the week this week, or are we taking the week off? We do indeed. This is somewhat, well, I mean, there's no way it couldn't be milder than last week's. So last week, after I thought I'd actually cause your brain to explode, this is going to be somewhat more benign.
It's time for the Dream Idiot's curse word of the week.
So you may recall that 2 or 3 weeks ago, I brought up the word fucktard and mentioned the fact that I thought I had invented the word, and of course I had not. But you and I do laugh about body functions and going to the bathroom and the various euphemisms used for, dropping the kids off at the pool, etc.
I never laugh at that, Bryan.
You never laugh at, right? My favorite euphemism for that is one that I do think I came up with, and so I would routinely say to an ex of mine that whenever I was going into the powder room, that I needed to go quote, evict the downstairs neighbor, unquote. And I'm the only, I think I coined this, and it's a euphemism I find especially funny, but it was mostly funny because it's a term, those jokes where some jokes are funny because you pass, you tell them to your audience, and if you get a good reaction because they find it funny as well, that's great. This is a euphemism that I like to share because she didn't find it funny at all. And the less funny she found it, the funnier I found it. So I would use it all the time, and then would go even further as to say, if I was in there for, maybe a longer period of time, I would come out and say, well, he was a hoarder. Or if it was a brief trip into the bathroom, I'd say, well, it was just a one bedroom, it was just an efficiency or something, in order to explain.
I had to call the sheriff's office to help me get this guy out.
Right. So anyway, evicting the downstairs neighbor. So anyone out there who wants to use that and torture their partner or loved ones who don't find these things funny, by all means, you can use that.
I'm going to say this right now that my wife will probably kill you next time she sees you.
Next time I'm there, I'll be sure to use it in front of her. I'm sorry. Where's your powder room? I have to go.
Yes, make it all classy. Where's your powder room?
Right. So there you have it.
Well, I will certainly take that over last week's.
Much more benign.
Now let's shift gears a whole lot because I do have a biographical story for us.
Nice. Okay.
And round about, 30 episodes or so ago, I said I was going to do a series on futurism. Do you remember me saying that, Bryan?
Yep. Herman Kahn.
We had a futurist. Well, I've got another Herman today, and he's also a futurist. So for my story today, I'm going to talk about futurist Herman Blount. Have you heard about Mr. Blount?
I've never heard the name. No.
Okay. This is also a story in celebration of Black History Month.
Sure.
So let's get started with Mr. Herman Poole Blount, and that is spelled Blount, but pronounced Blunt in the Southern style. He was nicknamed Sonny, and later he was called Snookum. Even his nieces and nephews called him Uncle Snookum. He was born in the magic city of Birmingham, Alabama, May 22nd, 1914. And his name Herman apparently came after being named after African-American stage magician Black Herman. And this was a gentleman who performed as a vaudevillian. He counted among his associates Marcus Garvey and Booker T. Washington. And wow. Black Herman was a name that was kind of actually passed down to other African-American stage magicians of the same time. Young Herman Blount was cared for by the women in his life, his mother, his grandmother, and his great aunt. He was particularly close to the elder women in his family. He would attend church often with the two of them. He showed a voracious appetite for knowledge and reading. By the third grade, his teachers were certain he had read everything that the school library had to offer. He was known as an intelligent but shy child. He would often play by himself or with his many cousins. He also loved to listen to his brother's ragtime records over and over again. And he could identify many of the records just by someone to say, hey, go get this. And he would be able to pull it out of the file and listen to it. When he was 8 years old, Herman eagerly followed the news from Egypt as the Carter expedition unearthed the tombs of Tutankhamun.
Right.
He became fascinated with ancient Egypt and the study of greater Africa as well. I'm always amazed that people forget, at least in my association with white folk like us, that Egypt is part of Africa. And that seems to be left out of a lot of conversations. I don't know why. It just seems to happen. But he became fascinated with ancient Egypt and the study of African history. And this would continue throughout his life. So, in addition to listening to music, he started to play music around the age of 11. He received a piano as a birthday gift from one of his great aunts. And this gift showed immediate results. He seemed to have the ability to play by ear. He could listen to records and replay quite a few of the tunes. He had no formal training for this. And folks soon figured out that he was teaching himself to read music as well. He seemed just to have a knack for it. He played in the school orchestra, of course. Anyone who could read music and do what he could do was an asset to a school orchestra. And at this time, his other social outlet, other than the church and the orchestra, he had a membership in what was kind of a scouting group called the American Woodman Junior Division. The American Woodman was kind of a scouting offshoot that we had here in the States in the early part of the century. And after high school, a lot of folks were expecting Herman to go to college, which he did. He attended Alabama State A&M Institute, a 2-year school that focused on things like, well, what agriculture mechanics, things that schools like that did, particularly in the early part of the century. And he, quote, and this is a self-quote, studied everything except farming there. He was on a teaching track. He took his first formal piano lessons in college. He was studying with Professor Lula Hopkins Randall. She had studied at the Chicago Musical College. He worked and studied compositions by Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Schumann. Professor Randall saw him transcribing music from a record one day, just on sheets of paper, just randomly transcribing music. And she said, "You know what? I need a teaching assistant."
As he heard it, he could just...
As he heard it, he would just write it down on the paper.
Wow.
And she asked him, she said, "I need a teaching assistant for my musical theory course, my music theory course. Would you come and be my teaching assistant?" So in addition to classical European composers, Professor Randall also included the work of contemporary African-American composers in her curriculum. And she encouraged Herman to pursue his own musical interests. So in his words, he studied, quote, Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, and Shostakovich. So he wasn't messing around. He really went the depth with a lot of classical European composers. But at the same time, he had listened to Fletcher Henderson and Duke Ellington and all of the other musicians growing up. Now, he left school sometime in 1936 or 1937 after an event that forever changed him. He came back to the dormitory and found some of his classmates reading his personal diary, where he had described something that had happened to him. He had reported to his diary that he had an incident where spacemen had contacted him. Yes. And he said, quote, "They were looking for someone with a certain type of mind. You had to have perfect discipline. My whole body was changed into something else, and I went up. I call that energy transformation because I wasn't in human form. I could see through myself." And he described the moment where his body was changed into pure energy and taken up into their ship. And the spacemen showed him visions of the future and told him not to return to school, that soon schools and society itself would be thrown into chaos. He was shown these visions of futures of skies that were dark red and purple. And in this early vision, he was asked if it was time for the spacemen to land on Earth. And he had a very specific vision of this bench. And later, when he was living in New York, this stone bench in this certain park area, he found that area that he had in this moment of this event.
The vision, right, yeah.
In this vision, he found the exact place that he had this vision of years before. It was up near Columbia in New York. So that happened to him, and he destroyed the diary, but he kept that memory of what happened to him when the spacemen had contacted him. And he returned to Birmingham after he left school. He lived in his great aunt's house, and he acted as a magnet for local musicians, where they would drop by at all hours to rehearse, to perform, to discuss new ideas, musical theory. He decided not to return to school, and so he gave up teaching, which was a solid employment.
Right.
For a Black man in the American South in the 1930s, in the late 30s. But he did eke out a living as a musician. He would play certain gigs, he would play dances, he would play popular tunes of the time. He was a very accomplished pianist. He did garner a reputation as an odd local character. He was well known for, and he would gladly tell the story that I just told you. He would tell it unashamedly, and he would tell it just matter of fact. That happened to him. Now, Herman had suffered from certain physical difficulties all of his life involving a hernia, and it brought him great pain most of his life. And as World War II approached, he had been dabbling in religion, and he was drawn to Seventh-day Adventism. And when the war approached, he realized that, yes, he had been opposed to war for a very long time. So he spent a fair amount of time trying to obtain conscientious objector status.
Sure.
And this didn't go so well. It was a difficult thing to do. And he had to stand up as a black man in the South and argue for why he was being a conscientious objector. He was given a deferment for alternative service, which is what happened to a lot of folks who are conscientious objectors. You can go work in the forestry. You can work here in the States. Or if you went over, you could be a corpsman. You could be all these other
medic,
things.
right?
Right. So he was given alternative duty in, I believe, a conservation corps in Pennsylvania, but he failed to show up. So he was thrown in jail for this. And he spent time in and out of jail. There may have been a suicide attempt at one point while he was in and out of jail, but he was ultimately classified, because of his hernia, as 4F in 1943. So this went on for some time into the war. After the war in 1945, he finally moved to Chicago, and he got to work with one of his heroes. I mentioned earlier Fletcher Henderson. Is that a name you're familiar with?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I don't have much knowledge or insight.
Well, I'm not much into the big band era of jazz. I mean, I like Duke Ellington, and Fletcher Henderson could have been on the level of the Duke Ellington, but he had problems keeping his bands together and keeping his men organized. In fact, there's a wonderful 3-disc collection of his music called A Study in Frustration, the Fletcher Henderson story. His brother Horace was also a jazz musician. He suffered a stroke on top of this in the mid 40s, and it robbed him completely of the ability to play piano because he was paralyzed on one side. So he took more of the role of an arranger and a producer than he did a performer. So Herman stepped in and performed as pianist of the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra off and on for a while during the great man's sunset years. Fletcher Henderson went and he lived for a little bit longer, but he died in 1952. Meanwhile, in addition to all of the music he was studying and performing and learning about under the tutelage of Fletcher Henderson, Herman sought out libraries and bookshops, reading as much as he could about ancient Egypt. He bought translation dictionaries for hieroglyphs. He bought a copy of Egyptian Book of the Dead. He continued to study the Christian Bible as his days from a child, taking particular note of the treatment of blacks and their marginalized existence in the text. That black people don't appear in the Bible except in the example of Cush and Ham, right? And right. The mark of Cain and all these things. He also questioned the inclusion of books as per the directions of the Nicene Creed. He wondered why certain books were included and others were not. He wondered if, in fact, the Bible itself was even put together in the correct order. What kind of story would the Bible tell if Revelations were the first book and Genesis the last? It'd be a much more hopeful story if that were the case, in many ways. He wanted to make connections between the Christian Bible and Egyptology. So he was constantly questioning the necessity of binary oppositions in the way we look at the world, between God and the devil, between good and evil, Alpha and the Omega, life and death, the beginning and the ending of things. So in addition to being a musician, he was also a philosopher. He made all kinds of comparative, you could say that he was a comparative religious studies guy. He looked at all these things. He also began to put together his own group of musicians and rehearse them around the clock. They picked up gigs here and there in Chicago. And in 1952, things came to fruition when Herman, aka Sonny Blount, decided to change his name. He said that person is gone. That person doesn't really exist anymore. So, taking into account his obsession with Egyptian culture, he had always had a particular fondness for the heliocentric god Ra. He changed his name to Lasani Ra, aka Sun Ra.
Sun Ra.
And for that, he was known as Sun Ra for the rest of his life. He also began to claim at this time that he was not, in fact, born in Birmingham, Alabama, but he was, in fact, born on the planet Saturn and deposited in Birmingham, Alabama, and given to human parents to be raised as an Earthman, only to help lead Black people back to where they belonged, which was the stars. Okay. By the late 50s, he had his own record label, and it's a remarkable story of his record label, El Saturn. He produced his own music. Often his records would be literally printed up at the shows and sold. They would be hand lettered. They would be painted. The covers would be painted right then and there. His group started performing live, wearing multicolored robes and hats, dancing and theater-like performances became part of this experience. Sun Ra and his orchestra became a source of controversy in the jazz world because many of the orthodoxy saw his outrageous costumes and presentation as a means to cover up musical deficits. But in the years since, a critical reassessment has brought Sun Ra to a new generation of jazz listeners. And how familiar are you with his work? You listen to a lot of Sun Ra?
I have listened to Sun Ra, but not at all recently. But I certainly, liked what I did. I mean, some of it's very out there, but I mean, some of it, I really enjoyed. But I mean, it's so many years removed now. I couldn't tell you like which albums.
Well, here's what some critics have had to say. Musicians who were unequipped to deal with the conventions of the past became significant figures. Without making a value judgment as to the merit of their work, this was nonetheless a sea change. Concurrently, both Sun Ra and the Art Ensemble of Chicago were mixing theater with a wide variety of jazz styles, and contained in their ensembles, some musicians were master improvisers, while others were far more limited, but nonetheless served a function. Groups such as these helped to stratify the declining jazz public even more, and called into question the whole process by which the music had evolved. And I would probably throw in there Henry Threadgill as well, with some of the work he did with Air, the trio that really went back and looked at ragtime compositions. I remember playing the heck out of all those Air albums we had at the radio station back in the 90s, right as the Sun Ra reissues were coming out. Another critic talking about Jazz in Silhouette. What's valuable about Jazz in Silhouette, an album that came out in 1958, is that it can silence the severest of Sun Ra's skeptics with its red-hot swing and bop tradition playing, its solid horn section charts, its steady rhythm, and yet also smuggles in a respectable chunk of the no-known language of Sun Ra's music. In 1958, the band had monster players, adepts at the mainstream language of jazz, and they and Sun Ra weren't faking anything, but they did like to pull the rug out from underneath jazz majority sound, and there were nice moments of disjunction. Blues at Midnight is a big band bebop piece, which Sun Ra ends with a solo on Celeste. That's right, Celeste, the instrument from Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy in Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. A review of the heliocentric Worlds of Sun Ra from 1965. Sun Ra made the theatrical element of his music so prominent that many in the jazz world found it hard to take him or his band seriously. This was a big mistake. From the mid-50s on, Sun Ra had a bracingly humorous and original take on the jazz tradition. He created his own frame of reference and eschewed more and more of the musical common denominators linking most jazz. It was a music that relied on ensemble textures and collective improvisation and an extraordinary array of instruments that had not yet found their way into jazz. This 1965 album has a remarkable thematic unity to it. It relies heavily on the bass marimba and the saxophone solos of John Gilmore to thread the pieces together. Like an ingredient and recipe that seems to be anomalous, but serves to throw everything into a new context, this album, with its own set of classic performances, may make you enjoy the music you already know that much more. And one last one, and this is probably one of the albums that you might be thinking of when you think of really out there stuff, The Magic City from 1965. The Mojo Record Guide. The 27-minute title track is a breakthrough work contemporaneous with Ornette Coleman's Free Jazz and John Coltrane's Ascension, but more fluid and obviously of a piece. The result of countless hours of development and rehearsal that enabled the orchestra's musicians to play in each other's pockets, even when they were navigating the most abstract sonic territory. In short, they could do it all. One night they would be playing Fletcher Henderson charts, swing, big band tradition. The next night they would be playing the most abstract stuff that you would try to figure out. And they could do it all in the course of one show. And finally, and this is just a piece on my part, when I was receiving a lot of these reissues in the early 90s at the radio station. I would be listening to these all the time, and I would track them down and put them into my own collection. The Penguin Guide to Jazz, which is a British jazz publication. And I wore mine out. It was literally falling apart when I finally recycled mine. It utilized your typical 1 to 5 star rating system, but it saved an additional rare crown rating.
Mm-hmm.
And this is for the albums for which even 5 stars was simply not enough to convey their greatness. And I'm going solely by memory here because my copy of the Penguin Guide to Jazz is long gone. There were only 22 or so crowned albums in that massive 900 plus page tome of album reviews. 22. Among them, Duke Ellington's Blanton Webster Band collection, Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, John Coltrane's Love Supreme, Charles Mingus's Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, and Sun Ra and his orchestra, Jazz in Silhouette. Sun Ra may not be up there on the Mount Rushmore of jazz greatness, but I'm not sure he'd want to be. He'd kind of be on a little hill off by himself,
right,
somewhere. He returned to Saturn via Birmingham, Alabama on May 30th, 1993, some 2 months before he was supposed to perform at the Montreal Jazz Festival that I attended. And I was really looking forward to seeing him in the orchestra perform, but I missed his transmission back, and he left this earth before I had a chance to see him. I cannot imagine a world without this man's music, his imagination, or quite frankly, his ability to incorporate religious texts and ideas into his music. And I don't want to. He was a remarkable musician and a hell of a thinker, and a man who was able to make statements about his own existence as a Black man in America that were on his terms and in his time and of his age. And for that, I commend him. Sources for this piece: Jim Irwin's Mojo Collection, the greatest albums of all time, for Mojo Books; Ben Ratliff's 2002 book, The New York Times Essential Library of Jazz; Lowen Schoenberg's The NPR's Curious Listener's Guide to Jazz; and John Sved's excellent 1997 biography, Space is the Place, The Lives and Times of Sun Ra.
Nice.
There you go.
Very cool.
Herman Sun Ra Blount.
Yeah, very cool. Yes, yeah, so some of those guys that kind of created spaces for themselves. I mean, when I was a younger person, I'm sure I was probably pretty dismissive of them, and would just say that I didn't like them. And as I've gotten older, I mean, some of those things, I'm very aware of the fact, as with Ornette Coleman, that I probably don't get it. But the fact that I don't get it doesn't mean I don't think there's merit there. So some of that stuff that's so I mean, there's lots of swing and ragtime and big band stuff that I love, and then some of the bop stuff I don't like it quite as much, and then some of those guys would just take a left turn and go, what the hell just happened? And so it's incredibly interesting stuff, and the fact that they could, some of these guys could dip their toes into so many different things that they have skills that I just don't possess. And so I'm just always sort of blown away by it.
And clearly his life tells you that he understood more about music. He forgot more about music than most of us will ever know. The way he was able to transcribe stuff, and just this astonishing memory, this ability to transcribe from ear just onto paper what he's hearing. That's a special kind of brain. But yeah, there are certain artists where I have a friend here who's a jazz musician, and we'll just be talking about music. And if I get to a certain period of time, he'll kind of cut me off and just go, yeah, that's when so-and-so, like that's when Miles lost his damn mind. That's when he gets to a certain point.
You're under arrest and that stuff.
Right. Well, oh no, it's before that. It's like Bitches Brew. He's prior to Bitches Brew. He's like, yeah, I'm done. It was like Kind of Blue was pushing it, and anything after Kind of Blue, it's like, no, I'm done, because he's more interested in the bop tradition, right?
Right.
So for him, it's all about Dizzy Gillespie and these guys, which is great. I mean, that's what makes jazz so interesting. But then I got into a discussion online where a guy actually started the discussion with, I love jazz, and he started with Rush and Carol Channing, and I was just like, no, we're not. I'm not having this discussion with you. We're not. You're baiting me. I know you're. And Kenny G was the other one. And I'm like,
And
I'm
Kenny
not
G,
debating
yeah,
this with you. This
yeah.
is not, none of this is improvisatory, nor is it based in the blues. I'm not having this discussion with you. And so then I got up on my little, like, my high horse, but I'm not
Right.
about to have that kind of discussion with someone. But Sun Ra was someone who always, no matter how out there he got, like, I would sit and give it a try. And
Right.
I scared, when I was teaching a cultural studies class, I scared some students off because I played some Sun Ra in class. And they're like, "You listen to that for fun?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do. It's, well, you don't like it?" And as opposed to Coltrane, where it's like, once Coltrane gets past, I don't know, once he starts getting into Ascension and Sunship and all that stuff, I'm like, yeah, I can't.
Yeah, I'm done. Right.
Or that 4 disc collection of Live in Seattle where it's 4 hour long cuts. I'm like, yeah, I'm done. But Sun Ra, I was always along for the ride. So
Yeah.
there you go. Futurist Herman Sonny Snookum Blount, aka Sun Ra.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks a lot. That was super interesting and someone I knew almost nothing about.
Were you you were starting to get it though, I think. You were kind of like, this is sounding familiar.
Like, I'm getting to connect these dots, right?
He also had a tendency to there would be certain, like, this is very kind of Clint Eastwood a la Heartbreak Ridge. Certain days he wouldn't be feeling it for certain colors. So if you would show up like with a red cap on, he would just stare at you until you got the message, and you would go home and change your cap or change your colors, because
Oh, if you were if you were on stage, not like in the audience.
No, in rehearsal. Okay. If you showed up and
Yeah.
and you were, certain days it was like, no, we're not doing red today. No one's doing red today, and so he'd kind of look at you.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Just give him what he wants.
Interesting dude.
Right.
And we might come back and take a look at him, because he was in Philadelphia when the Move housing complex was bombed by the Philadelphia police. So we might hear more from Mr. Ra
dovetail that story in later. Nice.
Down
Okay.
the line, if we ever cover a Move from Philadelphia in the 80s.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, there you go, folks.
Yes.
Two finally thoroughly random stories that are not in any way related. Unlike our Shakespeare weird karma that happened a few weeks ago.
Yeah, sometimes it happened.
Yep. Thanks for listening and staying with us after all this. It's 57 in the can, and we've got lots coming up here soon. We appreciate it. Reminder, go online, give us 5 stars on whichever platform you are using, Spotify, Apple, any of those. That would be great. Just drop us a line at dreamidiotspodcast@gmail.com, and that's all we got, I think.
Yeah,
thanks a lot.
Continue being good to each other. See you later.
Bye.
This is a Rough Tiger production.
Bong bong.
Mm-hmm.
Bryan.
Bong bong.
Bong bong.
Bong bong. Good.